Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow by Yuval Noah Harari. It's a pretty ambitious book that tries to map out where humanity might be headed.
It's a fascinating read. It really gets you thinking about the big picture, where we've been and where we might be going.
So one of the first things that struck me was how the book highlights just how far we've come in terms of overcoming some of those classic threats to humanity, famine, plague, war.
It's easy to take those things for granted today, but for most of human history, they were constant dangers.
The book actually mentions that in the 1690s, something like 15% of the French population died from famine.
Yeah, it was a different world back then.
It's hard to even imagine. Like today we have international organizations and systems that usually prevent those kinds of widespread famines, even after major disasters.
And the book points out this really interesting fact that today obesity actually kills more people than famine and malnutrition. It's kind of a mind-blowing shift in perspective,
Yeah.
right? But then the book asks this really provocative question. If we've kind of conquered these age-old threats, what takes their place? What's the next big challenge for humanity?
Well, Harari argues that it's not about checking things off a to-do list, but about confronting entirely new kinds of challenges.
Okay, so what are some of these new challenges?
One of the big ones is finding a way to balance our drive for economic growth with the urgent need to protect the planet.
Yeah, that's a huge one for sure.
It's a delicate balancing act between our desire for progress and the very real limits of our planet's resources.
It's like we're constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible, but we're also bumping up against those planetary limits.
Exactly. So ecological stability versus economic growth, that's definitely high on the list. But there are other big ones too.
Like what?
Well, how about immortality?
Immortality. You mean like living forever?
Yeah. The book argues that with advances in science and technology, we're getting closer and closer to understanding the aging process and potentially even reversing it.
So the idea is that defeating death itself could actually become a major focus for humanity.
It sounds crazy, but that's one of the possibilities the book explores.
Wow. Okay, so we've got ecological stability versus economic growth. We've got the quest for immortality. What else is on this new agenda for humankind?
Well, there's also the pursuit of happiness.
Happiness. That sounds like a pretty good goal.
It is, but it's more complicated than it seems. Now that we've largely addressed basic survival needs in many parts of the world, at least the question becomes, how do we define and achieve well-being?
Right, especially in a world where technology is evolving so rapidly and even has the potential to manipulate our emotions.
Exactly. The book delves into all sorts of potential dilemmas like, what happens if we can biochemically manipulate happiness or genetically engineer it, or even plug our brains directly into computers to experience some kind of simulated bliss?
It's like we might be on the verge of being able to hack happiness, but then the question becomes, is that really what we want? Are we chasing a biochemical definition of happiness or something deeper and more meaningful?
That's a big question the book asks us to grapple with. It's not just about feeling good. It's about understanding what it means to live a good life in a world where technology is blurring the lines between reality and simulation.
This all ties into what makes us uniquely human, right? And it was interesting that the book attributes human dominance not so much to individual intelligence, but to our ability to cooperate flexibly in large numbers.
It's a key insight. The book argues that it's not just about being smart. It's about being able to coordinate our actions and beliefs with others on a massive scale, something other primates can't really do.
It's about shared beliefs, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Harari brings up this really compelling example from the Romanian Revolution in 1989. Even though Ceausescu had this huge rally to show his support, it was ultimately a well-organized group united by a shared belief that seized control when his regime started to crumble.
That's a powerful example of how collective action fueled by shared belief can be so much stronger than any individual effort. And that brings us to the concept of intersubjective realities, which Harari talks about quite a bit.
These are things like many nations, gods, even human rights, things that exist because enough people agree they exist. They don't have any inherent reality outside of that shared belief.
It's kind of mind-bending when you think about it. Money, for example, is just paper, or even just digital bits. But we collectively agree it has value, and that shared belief gives it power in our societies.
Exactly. Same goes for borders or laws or even concepts like justice and freedom. They're all intersubjective realities.
It's amazing how these shared beliefs, these intersubjective realities, have shaped the course of human history, often more powerfully than any physical force. And the book argues that one specific intersubjective reality rose to become the dominant force in the modern world.
Humanism.
Humanism replaced God with human experience as the ultimate source of authority and meaning.
It's like we shifted from God says to my feelings tell me. A pretty radical shift in perspective, right?
Definitely. And as humanism spread, it kind of evolved into different versions, almost like denominations within a religion.
Okay, so what are some of these different flavors of humanism? Well, you have liberal humanism, which prioritizes individual feelings and freedom of choice above all else. Then you have socialist humanism, which emphasizes the collective good and the needs of others over individual desires. And then there's evolutionary humanism, which has a much darker history.
Wait, darker. You're talking about the Nazis, right? How does
Yeah.
a focus on human experience lead to something as horrific as that?
It's a tragic example of how even seemingly positive ideals can be twisted and distorted. Evolutionary humanism basically took the idea of survival of the fittest and applied it to entire societies, leading to a very dangerous and ultimately destructive worldview.
Okay, so humanism comes in different forms, some more appealing than others. But here's the question that keeps nagging at me. How does humanism in any of its forms hold up in a world where technology is advancing so rapidly? I mean, what happens when technology might render humans economically useless, challenge the very idea of free will, and even create new superhumans?
Those are some of the big cracks in the humanist foundation that the book starts to explore, and I think we should dive into those right after a quick break. Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about some of those challenges that technology poses to humanism. And one of the big ones that the book really digs into is this whole question of free will.
Yeah, that one's a real head scratcher. I mean, if our choices are really just the result of biochemical reactions happening in our brains, as the book suggests, then do we really have any control over our lives at all?
It's a question that has really puzzled philosophers for centuries. And now science is kind of adding fuel to the fire with new evidence that makes it even more complex.
Like those robo-rat experiments you mentioned earlier, the idea that scientists can actually manipulate a rat's movements just by stimulating certain parts of its brain is kind of mind-blowing.
It's definitely unsettling. It kind of makes you wonder if we humans are really any different from those robo-rats. Are we just more complex versions responding predictably to stimuli?
Right, like our choices just pre-programmed responses to electrical signals zipping around in our brains. It kind of makes you question the whole concept of free will.
It does challenge our assumptions. But the book does offer a glimmer of hope. It suggests that even if we don't have free will in the traditional sense, we might still be able to influence our desires and actions.
Okay, that's a bit of a relief. But how do we do that if our brains are essentially calling the shots? It seems kind of paradoxical.
The book points to things like meditation mindfulness, even cognitive behavioral therapy, as ways to kind of become more aware of our thought patterns and potentially even rewire our habitual responses.
So it's not about having total control, but more about understanding our own internal programming and finding ways to work with it.
Exactly. It's like recognizing that we might not be the authors of our own thoughts and desires, but we can become more skilled editors.
That's a really helpful analogy. Okay, so maybe we're not just puppets on a string. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about another big idea from the book, this whole concept of the Internet of all things. Dataism sees this interconnected network as kind of the ultimate goal, a future where everything and everyone is plugged in and sharing data.
It's a pretty mind-boggling vision when you think about it.
It does sound like something straight out of science fiction.
It does. But consider this. We're already surrounded by the building blocks of this interconnected web. I mean, you have the internet, social media, all these smart devices, the explosion of data collection in almost every aspect of our lives. It's not that much of a leap to imagine all of these things converging into one massive network.
It's true. I mean, we've got smart homes, smart cars, smart watches. I'm just waiting for my refrigerator to start ordering groceries for me. But what happens when this Internet of all things becomes so intelligent, so vast, that it surpasses human capabilities? Do we become obsolete?
That's a question that dataism really forces us to confront.
Right. It's like, are we just paving the way for our own extinction by creating something that's smarter than us?
Some people envision a kind of utopian future where this interconnected intelligence solves all our problems and creates a world of abundance and harmony.
But others might see it as more of a dystopian nightmare, right? Where we lose control and become subservient to the machines.
Exactly. It's like all those sci-fi movies where the AI takes over and humanity is left fighting for survival.
I've seen enough of those movies to be a little bit worried.
But that's precisely why it's so crucial to have these conversations now while these technologies are still being developed. We need to think critically about the kind of future we want to create and what role we want technology to play in our lives.
Mm.
We don't want to just sleepwalk into a future that we haven't consciously chosen.
It strikes me that datism, this idea that information flow is the ultimate driving force, really challenges some of our most fundamental assumptions about what it means to be human. Like all those things we hold dear: consciousness, self-awareness, free will. Maybe those things become less important in a world where data is king.
Absolutely. If dataism is right, then human experiences might not be inherently superior to the experiences of other organisms or even AI systems. It all comes down to how effectively something can process and contribute to the flow of information.
So you're saying that my profound thoughts about the meaning of life aren't necessarily more valuable than a squirrel's experience of burying a nut.
Well, dataism might argue that the value lies in what you do with those experiences. Can you translate them into data share, say, contribute to the collective pool of information?
So a squirrel can't write a blog post about its nut burying strategy, but I can write a poem about my existential angst and share it with the world. Does that make my experience more valuable in a datist framework?
You're getting it. In a datasist world, the ability to process and share information becomes a key measure of value.
Okay, so that explains our obsession with documenting our lives on social media. It's not just vanity, it's about proving that we're still relevant data points in the vast network.
Right. It's a fascinating shift in perspective.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder what other kinds of data we might be able to capture and share in the future. And maybe even more intriguingly, what happens to the experiences that we can't translate into data? Do they just fade away? Are they even real in a dataist sense?
Those are some big questions. Okay, so we've got this potential shift from human-centered values to a world where data reigns supreme. But how does that actually play out for us as individuals? Are we all destined to merge into some giant supercomputer, losing our individuality in the process?
The book doesn't necessarily predict that, but it does explore some pretty radical possibilities. And one of the scenarios it outlines is what Harari calls the great decoupling.
The great decoupling. Okay, I need a minute to wrap my head around that. What does that even mean?
It refers to the decoupling of intelligence from consciousness.
Okay, hold on. I'm still trying to process that. What does it mean to decouple intelligence from consciousness?
So basically it means that intelligence, the ability to solve problems, learn, and adapt, might not always be tied to consciousness, which is our subjective experience of the world, our feelings, our self-awareness.
So you're saying that we might be able to create machines that are incredibly intelligent, able to solve complex problems, even outperform humans in many areas, but without actually being conscious. Like, they could be brilliant problem solvers, but wouldn't have feelings or experiences like we do.
That's one of the possibilities the book explores. And it raises a whole bunch of questions about what we value most, intelligence or consciousness. What happens when they're no longer intertwined?
Right. Like, if you're a company trying to maximize profits, would you rather have a team of brilliant but emotionally complex humans or a super intelligent AI that can churn out solutions 24/7 without ever needing a coffee break?
It's a question with huge implications for the future of work and the value we place on human labor. And on a deeper level, it makes you wonder, if consciousness becomes optional, what happens to the inherent value of human life? Do we still matter if we're not the most intelligent beings on the planet?
It's like we're back to that robo-rat dilemma, right? If machines can do everything we can do but better and faster, what role is left for us? It's a pretty existential question.
It is. And dataism forces us to confront these really uncomfortable questions about our place in the universe. But the great decoupling isn't the only scenario the book explores. Another possibility is that humans might still be valuable collectively, but not individually.
Okay, so it's like we're still useful as a species, but individual humans become less important. Kind of like ants in a colony. The colony as a whole thrives, but no one really cares about any single ant.
Yeah. It's an interesting analogy. Think about things like crowdsourcing or big data analysis. These processes rely on the collective input of millions of people, but any single person's contribution might be pretty negligible.
So in that scenario, it's not about being a brilliant scientist or a talented artist or a successful entrepreneur. It's about being part of the data swarm.
Exactly. You're just one data point among millions. And then there's the possibility that even in a world dominated by AI and algorithms, some unique individuals will still be highly valuable.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Who are these lucky few? Are we talking about like the tech geniuses who created the super intelligent machines in the first place?
Maybe. Or maybe it's a new elite of upgraded superhumans who have been enhanced by technology, the very beings we were talking about earlier.
Superhumans. Okay, now we're really getting into sci-fi territory. It's both fascinating and a little bit terrifying to think about what that world would look like. What would these enhanced beings be capable of?
We're talking genetic engineering, brain-computer interfaces, the works. Imagine humans who are not only physically and intellectually superior, but can also control their emotions, access vast amounts of information instantly, and even connect their minds to form a kind of collective consciousness.
It sounds like something straight out of a movie. It could be the next step in human evolution or the beginning of a dystopian nightmare.
Exactly. And the book doesn't shy away from the potential dangers of these technologies, but it also acknowledges the incredible potential for advancements. It really is up to us to decide how we navigate this uncharted territory and what kind of future we want to create.
So we've got these three potential scenarios. The great decoupling, collective value versus individual value, and the rise of superhumans. What strikes me is that all of these possibilities really challenge the fundamental tenets of humanism, the very belief system that has shaped our world for centuries.
That's exactly the point the book is trying to make.
hmm
Humanism has been all about celebrating human experience, individual freedom, the power of reason. But what happens when technology starts to undermine those very things?
It's like the ground is shifting beneath our feet. We've built our whole world on these humanist ideals, and now we're facing a future where those ideals might no longer be relevant.
It can definitely feel disorienting. But maybe that's the point, to shake us out of our comfortable assumptions and force us to really grapple with what it means to be human in a world that's on the brink of radical transformation.
Wow. So much to think about. As we wrap up this deep dive into Homo Deus, I keep coming back to this idea of free will and how technology is really challenging our understanding of it.
Yeah, it's one of the most fundamental questions we face as humans, and technology is definitely forcing us to re-examine our assumptions.
I mean, if our choices are really just the result of these biochemical processes happening in our brains, like the book suggests, then do we really have any say in who we are and what we do?
It's a question that has philosophers and scientists scratching their heads. And those roborat experiments we talked about really drive home just how complex this issue is.
Right. To think that scientists can actually control a rat's movements just by stimulating certain parts of its brain,
Mhm.
it's kind of mind-blowing and a little bit scary, to be honest.
I agree. It definitely makes you question whether free will is just an illusion. But the book does suggest that even if we don't have free will in the traditional sense, we might still be able to influence our desires and actions. It's not a black and white issue.
Okay, so there's some hope then. It's not like we're completely powerless.
Right. The book points to practices like meditation, mindfulness, and things like cognitive behavioral therapy as ways to become more aware of our thought patterns and potentially even rewire those habitual responses.
So it's less about having total control and more about understanding how our brains work and using that knowledge to our advantage.
Exactly. It's like we might not be the authors of our own thoughts and desires, but we can become more skilled editors. We can shape and refine those thoughts and desires even if we didn't initially create them.
I like that analogy. It's a lot less daunting than the whole robo-rat scenario. But okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about this idea of the Internet of All Things, datism, sees this interconnected network as the ultimate goal, a future where everything and everyone is plugged in and sharing data constantly. Sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It does, but it's closer than we might think. We're already surrounded by the building blocks of this network. The internet, social media, smart devices, the massive amounts of data being collected about us every day. It's not hard to imagine all of this converging into one giant interconnected system.
That's true. We're already pretty connected as it is. But what happens when this Internet of All Things becomes so intelligent, so vast that it surpasses human capabilities? I mean, does that mean humans become obsolete? Are we just paving the way for our own extinction?
It's a question that datism really forces us to consider.
Right. Like, what happens if we create something that's smarter than us and it decides that it doesn't need us anymore? That's a pretty scary thought.
Some people envision a more utopian scenario, where this interconnected intelligence solves all our problems and creates a world of abundance and harmony for everyone.
Others might see it as more of a dystopian nightmare where we lose control and become slaves to the machines, like all those sci-fi movies where the AI takes over and turns on humanity.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to have these conversations now while these technologies are still being developed. We need to be thinking critically about the implications of these advancements and make conscious choices about the kind of future we want to create. We don't want to just passively accept whatever comes our way.
Well said. Homo Deus really doesn't shy away from those tough questions, and it's been a fascinating deep dive into some of the biggest challenges and opportunities facing humanity in the 21st century. It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
I agree. It's a thought-provoking book that pushes us to re-examine our assumptions about the world and our place in it.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. The book argues that humans have already conquered famine, plague, and war. But what if the ultimate human quest isn't about conquering external threats?
What if it's about understanding ourselves and our place in this increasingly complex and interconnected world? What if it's about figuring out how to navigate the incredible possibilities and potential pitfalls of technology in a way that preserves our humanity and creates a truly flourishing future for everyone?
That's a powerful thought. And on that note, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, keep asking questions, and never stop diving deep into whatever sparks your curiosity. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the future of humanity.